Hi everyone, welcome to our video today where we discuss a very interesting chapter entitled What is Translation? So this is basically more of the theoretical part of the course where we try to understand more about the nature of translation and the translation business nowadays in Egypt and in other countries as well. So today we'll be discussing together the chapter entitled What is Translation from the book entitled Translation the Basics by Julian House. So here are the questions. What is translation? How is translation different from interpreting? And explain why over the centuries translation has been regarded both positively and negatively. And also translation is considered a secondary type of communication. Why? Why is that? And also translation generally involves two phases. What are they? And which method do you think is better when translating texts of authority, basically religious texts, for example? Word for word translation or sense for sense translation? In other words, literal translation versus free translation.
Or if it's the boy's name, usually with no E in one end, it would be Julian. So I guess because of the E, I guess it's Julian. Especially if it's a girl, then it would be Julian. If it's a man, then it would be Julian.
Julian House? Julian.
Girl's name, you would say Julianne. But usually they spell the girl's name with two N's. But maybe she spells it with one. Or if it's the boy's name, usually with no E in one end, it would be Julian. So I guess because of the E, I guess it's Julianne. Especially if it's a girl, then it would be Julianne. If it's a man, then it would.
So how is translation different from interpreting? We have translation, which is basically has to do with the written mode, and then we have interpreting, which has to do with the oral mode or the spoken language. So in written translation, a fixed, permanently available and in principle unlimitedly repeatable text in one language is transformed into a text in another language, which can be corrected as often as the translator sees fit. By contrast, in interpreting, an oral text in one language is changed into a new text in another language, which is, as a rule, available to the interpreter only once. So basically, in translation, so a translation of a written text, the translator has a new story to translate or a short story and so on. So the text is there, the translator can translate it, and then he or she can again edit the translation and so on, versus interpreting, which is basically simultaneous interpretation, for example, or what we call ترجمة فورية. So there isn't actually a chance to do so, because the translator or the interpreter usually interprets or translates the spoken language on the spot. So again, one important difference between interpreting and translation is that in translation, the source text is available to the translator in its entirety. So the whole text is there, the whole news story is there, the whole novel is there. Whereas in interpreting, it's generally presented and interpreted bit by bit. So basically, just the interpreter, let's say the interpreter is interpreting a speech in a conference, for example. So the interpreter translates or interprets chunks of the language instead of having the whole text written in front of them, like in translated in written translation. Or sometimes the speech given might be written prior to the conference, but this is this is a different story. So a further crucial difference between these modes of mediating is that in written translation, neither the author of an original text nor the potential addressees are usually present, which means that no overt interaction or direct feedback can take place. So basically, in written translation, the translator translates the text without having any sort of feedback from his or her readers, and neither from his or her readers nor from the author of the text usually. I mean, sometimes of course, it depends, but not all translators have access to the authors of the original text where they can actually have a conversation and ask them what they mean exactly and so on. But in interpreting, it's different because both author and addressees are usually present, so interaction and feedback may occur. So again, the example we have here is if someone is interpreting a speech in a conference. So basically, this interpreter can get feedback both from the audience who listen basically to the interpretation, and again from the speaker of the original or source text. But of course, in written translation, this is not usually the case. You know, I'm sure that you have read many translated texts, maybe news stories and so on, but you don't really have a chance to give feedback to the translator and say, by the way, I liked your translation, or your translation is not that good, I didn't really get the point. Over the centuries, translation has been regarded both positively and negatively. So why is that? Positively, because translation can provide access to new ideas and new experiences that stem from a different language community, opening horizons that would otherwise remain unknown behind the barrier of another language. Basically, if you don't speak Russian or Japanese and so on, how would you know about these cultures? You need to, you basically will read a translated text in your mother tongue, or maybe in another language that you speak, like English and so on. So translators are valued because their act of mediating between different languages, cultures, and societies provides an important service for people who only speak their mother tongue. Negatively, you know, and this is a point of view, that because translated text can never be the real thing. You know, we always have this idea of loss in translation, that there must be some sort of loss or some aspect of language loss in translation. Could be related to the language, the structure, the culture, and so on. So translation remains something secondhand, a kind of inferior substitute for the original. And this is, again, this is a point of view, but I personally favor the positive point of view, because from the positive perspective, translation has often been compared to an act of building bridges or extending horizons and exposing readers and people to different cultures. So there is a more chance for to avoid misunderstanding, basically, and this is actually the belief from which all translation courses we study stem from. So why is translation considered a secondary type of communication? So translation is of its nature a type of secondary communication because in the process of translating an original communicative event, be it a speech or a written news story and so on, is repeated in order to enable persons to understand and appreciate the original event from which they would otherwise be excluded. And this is how it's a secondary type of communication. So it is based on a primary type of communication, which is whatever, as I mentioned, a news story, a speech, and so on. And the translation is basically a replication of the original text or original mode of communication in a way that would enable other people to understand and appreciate the original text. So a translation generally involves two phases. What are they? The first phase is the phase in which the translator understands and interprets the source text. So think about this as a translator, you would actually first read the text and try to understand it. And then a second phase would be in which the translator's interpretation is rendered in the target language. So after you've read the text and fully understood, like think about when you translate idioms, for example, you look up the idioms that you don't know and you understand their meaning, and then this is the first step. And then the second step is actually you attempting to translate and render the meaning to in the target language. So the following question has to do with translating texts of authority, and the book mentions examples of texts of authority like religious texts, for example, or even political speeches, for example. So which method do you think is better? Word-for-word translation or sense-for-sense translation, or in other words, literal translation versus free translation. So I have a couple of examples to show you what these types of translations look like. So here's an example of the word-for-word translation. That child is intelligent. So it's translated as ذاك الطفل يكون ذكيا. And we of course know that when we translate into Arabic, usually the verb to be is not translated as يكون. It just kind of implicitly included in the meaning of the sentence. So we would say something like ذاك الطفل ذكي, ذاك الطفل ذكيا, without the need to include يكون. And also the book mentions that translators in the past used to prefer to stick to literal translation or word for word translation to rather stay on the safe side and not get into trouble because of their translations. Now here is an example of free translation, which is very idiomatic. So for example, he got nothing at the end is translated into an idiom as رجع بخفي حنين or عاد خالي الوفاض. Also number 9, for example, she had a new baby is translated into رزقها الله مولودا جديدا, although in the source text in English there isn't actually this religious aspect of giving birth to a baby. However, when the translator translated this into English, they basically chose to add this because it rather suits the culture of the target language in Arabic. So this is I mean, of course, there are also several examples of free translation where actually the translator kind of adds more depth or maybe more ideas, or includes more of the culture of the target language that basically might not exist in the source text. So we have again some other questions to discuss together. Should we think of translation as an art or as a science? Which is more important, translation, the content or the form, and so on? You can pause the video and read the questions on your own. So we'll move to the following slides. Should we think of translation as an art or a science? Of course, the book, I really I don't know what you're thinking, but to me, I would think both. Actually, it's hard to decide on one. So the book tells us that if translation is to be looked upon as an art, then in which case, often with regard to literary translation, the worth and success of the translation is said to depend to a very large extent on the intuition and the competence of the translator. And of course, here this point has to do with translation of literary texts like poetry, like novels and drama and so on. So here it's an art in the sense that the translator is an artist. The translator would read a poem, for example, and try to translate the meanings, understand, of course, the significance of the poem and the purpose of the poet and so on, and render all this into the target language, and maybe also consider some aspects of the target culture. And of course, this is not just a mechanic process of translation. It requires a lot of actually of art, of culture of being as a translator, you have to be very well read, and you have a taste, and you understand literature and appreciate arts and so on. However, if one looks upon translation as a subject to be studied as a science, which is kind of what we're doing in our classes, it's a course, you have translation courses, and there are exams in translation, so it's more like a science which has rules that should be followed and so on. So the translator and his or her capabilities will not be the center of attention, but rather more objective criteria for producing and testing a translation will need to come to the forefront. So basically, like what we sometimes do together as evaluating the translations we attempt, and see how they communicate the message in the source text, for example, how accurate they communicate the message in the source text, and so on. So the second question we had was, which is more important in translation, the content or the form of the text? Again, one of the questions that we keep asking all the time, which is more important? Again, so a distinction is often made between translation of literary texts, and by literary texts, again, we mean poems, novels, plays, and so on, and translation of pragmatic or non-literary texts. And by that we mean basically the kind of translations we do in class together, translation of news stories and news headlines and so on. So in the case of literary text, the linguistic form is never arbitrary. This means that the form needs to be considered essential in any translational act. So basically, what we mean here is that if I am a translator who's trying to translate a text, a poem, for example, so I should consider the rhyme, for example. And we find some translators who try to create rhythm and rhyming lines when they translate plays, for example, Shakespeare's plays or so on. So they try to consider this form, the linguistic form. So they try to add this into their translations as well. So in the case of non-literary texts, like news stories, for example, or maybe legal texts or something, it's the content that needs to be preserved, often at the expense of the linguistic form. Again, if we're translating some instructions, for example, instruction manual, some news story, some legal text, or so on, here the content and the communicating the meaning is crucial and very important, more than the linguistic form or the rhyming of the speech and so on. So the following question is, how can computer-mediated tools best assess translators? So we always ask, is it okay to use Google Translate or not in our translation? Maybe this is the first thing that comes to mind when we think of computer-mediated tools for translators. So a growing number of continuously improved computer programs that assist the human translation in different ways are now available. So these programs or this software actually can help translators through providing access to huge online dictionaries, of course, so lexical resources basically. Also, they can help translators retrieve a lot or a host of idiomatic and otherwise highly predictable target language structures, so what we call predictive texts, for example. And of course also some encyclopedic knowledge banks which can help in covering knowledge gaps. So for example, if you're translating a text and the text mentions a name of a character in a movie, or a name of a special public holiday or something that the translator might not be aware of, so here comes the CAT, basically computer mediated tools can help with that, can draw the attention of the translator to special events, for example, or the names of special characters and so on. So computers thus liberate human translators for more interesting, more creative, and less mechanical parts of the translation process. So we always have this question, will robots or will CAT replace human translators? So they actually sort of now they complement each other in that So these tools liberate human translators to basically pay attention to more demanding tasks of decision making and problem solving and fine tuning of their stylistic choices. So basically, these tools like Google Translate, for example, you can use it initially, to translate texts, but then you have to add your own human input, as it mentions here. So doing some decision making, which words to keep, which idioms, for example, to use, and some fine tuning and editing of grammar and style is of course necessary. So research, basically in terms of Google Translate, research has shown that it works better with closely related European languages. So if you're translating from English to French, for example, or vice versa, the translation works, or Google Translate works better with that, but may not work very well with structurally different language pairs. So for example, translating English to Japanese and so on. The truth is that fully automated, high quality computerized translation is still not possible today. So there's still need for human input. And computerized translation system currently available, while far from perfect today, are constantly being improved upon. So maybe one day we will have fully automated CAT tools basically, but for the time being we still thankfully, translators are still needed. Computer-mediated translation are useful for translations of specialized technical text because content and form are routinized and highly predictable. So again, a translation of manuals, for example, or scientific texts. So the focus is more on the content rather than the style and the form. So in this case, the CAT tools will work better. But when it comes to literary texts like poetry, like drama, plays, and so on, it seems difficult to imagine that computers will replace human translators, as we mentioned, and this has to do with translation being an art. So again, the translator here is more like an artist, and basically the computer cannot replace human translators when it comes to this translation of literary text, at least in the near future. Because connotative meanings, cultural associations, and also a strong reliance on contextual cues make it unlikely that this will happen, or that computers will be aware of all this and be able to translate a literary text or a text of literature in an artistic and creative way like a human translator would. So the final question is, what are the skills future translators need to improve? So did you guess from our discussion of CAT, computer-mediated tools, you might have guessed what skills translators need to improve in the future. So of course they need to enhance their editing skills, pre and post editing of text, and computer skills. So computer skills in order to be able to deal with computer-mediated tools, CAT. And also because, as we mentioned, that using computer-mediated tools helps translators work more on fine-tuning the stylistic and grammar choices in the text, and basically free them for more of the decision making on which basically aspects of the texts need more need better translations basically, or need to be edited. So these two skills are very important: editing skills and also computer. So a final note in this chapter is on culture and translation. So dates like the 4th of July, for example, or the 6th of October for us Egyptians are linked to important events that basically belong to the cultural memory of a nation. So names of cities, specific incidents, spiritual and political leaders, for example, all these are really important to be known by the translator. So the translator has to have an idea about all these basically names of city, important cities, specific incidents, and so on, in both the source and the target text. And this is what I was just telling you about, that computer assisted tools can help with that actually. So if you're translating a text and then for example, the Rosa Parks incident pops in the translation, basically the software or the program will draw your attention. You can read an article on Wikipedia, for example, that briefly tells you what this incident was about, so that it's for you. You can, as a translator, be aware of this as you're translating. So there are, of course, many such culturally embedded items in text to be translated. So the translator needs to be aware of the cultural associations and implications of the language used in the original text, and they also need to understand the cultural context in which the translated text is to live. So basically, the translator needs to be aware of the culture of both the source and the target text. And this is, again, I take you back to the example we discussed earlier in this presentation. She gave birth, or she had a new baby, and the translation was رزقها الله بمولود جديد. So the translator here chose to add an aspect, this religious aspect, basically, because it suits more the culture, the target culture, basically, or the culture of the target language. So what this tells us actually is that the translator needs to be aware of the culture, and needs to be very well read. So as a person, as a translator, you need to be aware of everything going on, reading the news, always exposed to literature, art, and so on. Also maybe reading a bit in history and so on, to be a well-educated and well-read person, plus of course having a very good command in both the source and the target language. So what are some of the translation domains nowadays? Where do we see translation in our everyday life, for example? I wonder what your answers are. So let's see here. So translation domains today would be, of course, news reporting, in tourism, in commercial purposes. When you're walking down in the street, you would find lots of billboards. Even here in Egypt, lots of billboards are actually written in the ads on these billboards are written in English, and so on. Also on social media, we find the use of English and also other languages as well, and some translations are available. So providing information on products using local languages will substantially improve sales potentials. Here also translation is also used in software localization. So this means using Arabic. For example, if we're thinking or if we're discussing our situation here in Egypt, you will find some that many apps, if not all actually, have Arabic as a language. Also localized advertising, so producing a localized version of a product, which is essential to open up new markets across the world. Also basically, I was just discussing this, but in terms of English in billboards, for example, also translation is has to do with the expansion of digital industries centered around e-learning, like what we're doing now, and other education forms spread over the web in many different languages. Again, shows the intimate link between translation and today's global economy. So this picture again illustrates what we just discussed. So we have apps in Arabic like Facebook. They all have the option, of course, including Arabic for Facebook, for example, means an increase in the number of users of any app, not just Facebook. Also in the news stories, we have here BBC in Arabic and so on. So news, we said news stories, of course, this is a domain where translation is needed all the time on a daily basis. Every day there is new news, and basically this news needs to be translated. And also in products and so on. So it's always translations if you have like a piece of clothing and you check the label, you would find that the instructions for washing, for example, if is written, the instructions for washing this piece are written in different languages, basically. So I leave you with a couple of questions here, just for discussion and for contemplation, and I hope you would actually comment with your answer. Do you think computerized translation systems will replace human translators? One day we kind of discussed this very briefly today, but I would love to hear what you have to say about that. Also, based on your own reading of the chapter we discussed today, what skills should future translators necessarily have other than the two skills that we mentioned? Do you think there are other skills that translators have to have in the future? So this brings me to the end of my presentation. Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.